The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, golden liquid spreading like blood across the pristine white tiles. My stepmother's triumphant smile faltered for just a moment as she watched me collapse, my hand clutching at my throat, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The guests at her victory celebration gasped in horror, but she quickly composed herself, rushing to my side with practiced concern. "Someone call an ambulance!" she cried, cradling my head in her lap while her perfectly manicured fingers checked for a pulse she knew was fading. Her Oscar-worthy performance fooled everyone except me. I could see the satisfaction gleaming in her eyes as my vision blurred. The poison was working faster this time. Perhaps she'd increased the dose. Or maybe my 23-year-old body was simply weaker than it had been at 28 in my last life. Either way, as the darkness crept in from the edges of my vision, I found myself smiling. Because this time, I knew exactly what would happen next. This time, her victory party would become her funeral. Death is strange when you've experienced it before. The panic that should accompany those final moments was replaced by an odd sense of anticipation. I knew what came after this darkness. I'd lived through it once already, waking up 5 years in the past with every memory of my stepmother's betrayal intact. The first time I died at her victory party, poisoned by the champagne she'd handed me herself to toast her acquisition of my late father's company, I'd been shocked, heartbroken, and utterly unprepared. This time, I'd walked into her trap willingly. I'd let her win exactly what I wanted her to have, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why I chose to die again, you need to know about the 5 years I've lived twice, and the woman who killed me both times. My stepmother, Victoria Chen, entered our lives when I was 15. My mother had died of cancer 3 years earlier, leaving my father and me to navigate our grief alone. He'd thrown himself into work, building his pharmaceutical empire to new heights, while I'd thrown myself into my studies, desperate to make my dead mother proud. We were two ships passing in the night, united only by our shared loss and the sprawling mansion that felt too empty without her laughter. Victoria changed that. She was everything my mother wasn't, calculating where mom had been warm, ambitious, where mom had been content, stunning in a sharp architectural way where mom had been soft and comforting. My father was entranced immediately. She was 32 to his 51, a brilliant chemist who'd worked her way up from nothing, or so her carefully crafted backstory claimed. Within 6 months of meeting her at a medical conference, he'd married her. Within a year, she'd convinced him I needed structure and discipline, which translated to boarding school in Switzerland. I spent my remaining teenage years in exile, returning home only for holidays where Victoria would parade me around like a prop in her perfect family tableau before shipping me back as soon as the cameras stopped rolling. My father, lost in his new wife's web, barely noticed my absence. His calls grew less frequent, his emails shorter. By the time I graduated and returned home at 18, I was a stranger in my own house. But I was also my mother's daughter, and she'd left me something Victoria hadn't counted on: 49% of the company shares, held in trust until my 25th birthday. My father owned another 49%, with 2% belonging to the board. It was meant to ensure I'd always have a voice in the company my mother's family had helped build. It was also, though I didn't know it then, the reason Victoria wanted me dead. The first 5 years after my return from boarding school followed a predictable pattern. Victoria marginalized me at every turn. She convinced my father I was too young, too inexperienced, too emotional to be involved in company decisions. She planted seeds of doubt about my capabilities, my mental stability, even my loyalty to the family. When I excelled at university, graduating summa cum laude with a degree in biochemistry like my mother before me, she dismissed it as bought with daddy's money. When I developed a promising new drug compound during my internship, she buried the research, claiming it was derivative of her own work. My father, by then, was completely under her spell. The vibrant, loving man who'd once read me bedtime stories and taught me to ride a bike had become a hollow echo of himself, parroting Victoria's opinions and dismissing my concerns as jealousy. When he died suddenly of a heart attack just 3 months before my 25th birthday, I was devastated but not surprised. The autopsy showed nothing suspicious. His heart had simply given out, weakened by years of stress and, as I learned later, a carefully administered cocktail of untraceable compounds that Victoria had been slipping into his morning coffee for months. With my father gone, the battle for the company began in earnest. Victoria, as his widow, inherited his 49%. I would receive mine in 3 months. Together with the board's 2%, she could maintain control, but only if she could convince them I was unfit to be a major shareholder. She launched a campaign of character assassination that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. First came the rumors of drug abuse, supported by doctored medical records and paid witnesses who swore they'd seen me at parties I'd never attended. Then came the financial irregularities, company funds that had supposedly gone missing during my brief internship, with a clear digital trail leading back to accounts in my name that I'd never opened. The coup de grace was the mental health angle, a diagnosed personality disorder, complete with a psychiatrist's evaluation from a doctor I'd never met and prescriptions for antipsychotics I'd never taken. By the time my 25th birthday arrived, the board was ready to vote me out entirely. Victoria organized a grand celebration, ostensibly for my birthday, but really to celebrate her complete takeover of Chen Pharmaceuticals. She invited everyone who mattered, board members, investors, society reporters, even my old friends from school who'd been told I'd had a breakdown and needed support. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, and I walked into it like a lamb to slaughter. She handed me the poisoned champagne herself, smiling as she proposed a toast to family, to legacy, and to new beginnings. I drank deeply, grateful for any kindness from the woman who'd stolen everything from me. 20 minutes later, I was dead on her marble floor. My death ruled a tragic accident caused by an allergic reaction to something in the champagne. Victoria inherited my shares as the only remaining family member. The company was hers, the victory was complete. Except death wasn't the end. I woke up gasping, not in a hospital or morgue, but in my childhood bedroom, the morning sun streaming through windows I hadn't seen in 5 years. My hands were smaller, unmarked by the lab burns I'd acquired during my university research. The calendar on my wall showed a date that made no sense. 5 years before my death, 2 weeks after my father's wedding to Victoria, the day before I was to leave for boarding school. At first, I thought I was dreaming, or perhaps experiencing some kind of near-death hallucination. But as the days passed and the events I remembered began to unfold exactly as they had before, I realized the impossible had happened. I had been given a second chance. I could save my father. I could expose Victoria. I could reclaim everything she'd stolen. I tried the direct approach first. The night before leaving for boarding school, I went to my father's study and laid out everything I knew. How Victoria would slowly poison him. How she would frame me. How she would steal our company. He looked at me with such disappointment and concern that my heart broke all over again. By morning, Victoria had convinced him I was having a mental breakdown, jealous of his new happiness and lashing out with paranoid fantasies. They sent me to boarding school with a therapist's contact information and a prescription for anxiety medication I didn't need. From Switzerland, I tried to gather evidence. I hired private investigators with my trust fund allowance, but Victoria was too careful, too clever. Every lead dried up. Every source disappeared. I watched from afar as she tightened her coils around my father, as his emails grew shorter and his calls less frequent, as history repeated itself with crushing inevitability. I changed tactics. If I couldn't prevent the past, perhaps I could alter the future. I studied differently this time, focusing not just on biochemistry, but on corporate law, forensic accounting, and business management. I built a network of allies among my classmates, the children of powerful families who could help me when the time came. I created hidden accounts and shell companies, moving money from my trust fund into places Victoria couldn't touch. Most importantly, I developed my mother's incomplete research into a revolutionary cancer treatment, filing patents under assumed names and building a secret fortune Victoria knew nothing about. When I returned home at 18, I played the part of the broken, defeated stepdaughter. I let Victoria marginalize me. I let her plant her evidence and spread her rumors. I even helped her along, making strategic mistakes that reinforced her narrative of my incompetence. All the while, I was building my own trap, one she would walk into as willingly as I'd walked into hers. The key was understanding Victoria's fatal flaw, her greed. She didn't just want the company. She wanted everything my family had ever built. She wanted the patents my mother had developed, The connections my grandparents had cultivated, the entire Chen legacy rewritten with her as its architect. And I was going to give it to her, or at least I was going to make her think I was. 3 months before my 25th birthday, right on schedule, my father died of his heart attack. I grieved genuinely this time, even knowing it was coming. I'd tried subtle ways to prevent his poisoning, switching his coffee, hiring a food tester under the guise of a new chef, even trying to convince him to see a different doctor. But Victoria was too careful, too adaptable. She found other ways to administer her toxins, and my interference only made her more cautious. In the end, I had to let him go to save everything else he'd built. This time, though, I was ready for Victoria's campaign against me. Every piece of false evidence she planted, I documented. Every witness she paid, I recorded. Every digital trail she created, I traced back to its source. But I didn't reveal any of this. Instead, I played into her hands, acting increasingly erratic and unstable, giving her exactly the villain she was trying to create. 2 weeks before my birthday, I made my masterstroke. I publicly announced that I was renouncing my claim to the company's shares, that I recognized I wasn't ready for such responsibility, and that I wanted Victoria to have them. The board was shocked. Victoria was suspicious. But I sold it perfectly, breaking down in tears at the board meeting, confessing to struggles with mental health, admitting to mistakes I'd never made, and begging them to let Victoria take care of the company my family had built. Victoria's suspicion turned to triumph. She'd won without a fight. The board, moved by my honesty and humility, agreed to transfer my shares to her immediately upon my 25th birthday. The lawyers drew up the papers, the press releases were prepared. Victoria planned her victory party, the same party where she'd poisoned me in my first life. But the papers they drew up weren't quite what they seemed. You see, during my years of legal study in Switzerland, I'd learned about a peculiar clause in our company's founding charter, something my grandmother had insisted on when she'd helped fund the initial venture. It was called the blood legacy provision, and it stated that shares passed down through direct bloodline could only be permanently transferred to another blood relative. Any transfer to a non-blood relative was considered temporary guardianship, reversible if the original heir reclaimed them within 1 year, or if the guardian was found guilty of a crime against the family. Victoria, brilliant as she was with chemistry and manipulation, had never studied corporate law. She'd never read the full charter, hundreds of pages of dense legal text that seemed largely ceremonial. Her lawyers, the best money could buy, had missed it too because I'd made sure they were looking at modified versions of the documents, authentic in every way, except for that one crucial clause that I'd had my allies on the board quietly reinstate during a routine charter review 2 years earlier. The night before my birthday party, I met with Thomas Chen, my father's cousin, and a board member who'd always been skeptical of Victoria. I handed him a safety deposit box key and told him that if anything happened to me at tomorrow's party, he should open the box immediately. Inside was everything. 5 years of evidence meticulously gathered, including video recordings of Victoria preparing the poisons she'd used on my father, documents showing her embezzlement and fraud, and most damningly, a recorded confession she'd made to her lover, a man she didn't know was my hired actor, about how she'd killed my father and planned to kill me. "Why not reveal this now?" Thomas asked, horrified by what he was reading. "Because she needs to think she's won," I replied. "She needs to take the shares publicly in front of everyone. She needs to sign the papers, and then, when she thinks she's untouchable, that's when she'll make her move against me. That's when she'll reveal her true nature in front of everyone who matters." Thomas wanted to go to the police immediately, but I convinced him to wait. I needed Victoria to attempt murder in front of witnesses. I needed her to hand me that poisoned champagne with her own hands, while cameras were rolling and the board was watching. The day of my 25th birthday arrived with all the pomp Victoria had planned. The mansion was decorated like a palace, with golden everything and champagne fountains that seemed grimly appropriate given what I knew was coming. The guest list read like a who's who of the pharmaceutical industry, with reporters and photographers capturing every moment. Victoria had outdone herself with her appearance, wearing a white designer gown that made her look like a victorious queen. I'd chosen to wear my mother's favorite dress, a simple black number that I'd kept hidden all these years. The symbolism wasn't lost on those who remembered my mother, and I saw more than a few sympathetic glances as I moved through the crowd. The shares transfer ceremony was scheduled for 8 o'clock, with the champagne toast immediately after. I signed the papers with a shaking hand, playing up my emotional distress as I gave away my birthright. Victoria's signature was bold and triumphant. The board members witnessed, the lawyers notarized. The photographers captured the historic moment when Chen Pharmaceuticals passed fully into Victoria Chen's control. And then came the toast. Victoria poured 2 glasses of champagne from a special bottle she'd kept aside, just as she had in my first life. She handed me mine with the same satisfied smile, though this time I thought I caught a flicker of something else, perhaps the tiniest hint of respect for how easily I'd given up. "To family," she began, raising her glass as the room fell silent. "To legacy, and to new beginnings." I raised my glass in return, meeting her eyes. "To getting exactly what we deserve," I said, and drank deeply. The poison was faster this time, more concentrated. Victoria had learned from whatever research she'd done, creating something that would look like an allergic reaction, but would actually be a sophisticated neurotoxin that attacked the respiratory system. Within minutes, I was on the floor, gasping for breath as the horrified crowd pressed in around us. But this time, I wasn't afraid. This time, as Victoria cradled my head and called for an ambulance, I managed to whisper loud enough for the nearest guest to hear. "Why? Why did you poison me? Just like father." Victoria's face went white. "She's delirious," she said quickly. "Someone call a doctor." Dr. Marcus Webb was already pushing through the crowd. I'd hired him months ago, positioning him as a guest at the party specifically for this moment. He knelt beside me, checking my vitals with professional efficiency while slipping the pre-prepared antidote into my vein under the cover of taking my pulse. The antidote wouldn't work immediately. I needed to appear dead for at least a few minutes, but it would prevent permanent damage. "Everyone step back," Dr. Webb commanded, beginning CPR compressions that looked convincing but were carefully calibrated not to actually break my ribs. "Someone get the emergency kit from my car and nobody touch anything. If this is poisoning as she suggested, everything here is evidence." Those words changed the entire atmosphere. The word evidence triggered Thomas Chen, who immediately called for security to seal the room. The photographers, sensing a bigger story than a simple shares transfer, began documenting everything. Several guests who'd been recording the toast on their phones continued filming, capturing Victoria's increasingly panicked attempts to maintain control. "This is ridiculous," Victoria protested. "She's having an allergic reaction. I would never." "Then you won't mind if we test the champagne," Thomas interrupted, having already retrieved the bottle she'd poured from. "And review the security footage from the preparation areas, and examine your personal laboratory in the East Wing that you think nobody knows about." Victoria's composure cracked for just a moment, but it was enough. She lunged for the champagne bottle, trying to knock it from Thomas's hands, but he was ready for her. Security restrained her as she struggled, her perfect facade finally shattering. "You don't understand," she shrieked. "She gave me everything. The shares are mine. The company is mine. I earned it. I deserve it." Dr. Webb chose that moment to announce, "I've got a pulse. She's responding to the treatment." I let my eyes flutter open, focusing on Victoria's horrified face as the police sirens grew closer. The security deposit box Thomas had opened an hour earlier, following my death, had triggered an immediate response from law enforcement. They'd been waiting outside, watching the live feed from the security cameras, gathering the evidence they needed for an arrest. "Impossible," Victoria whispered as I slowly sat up, supported by Dr. Webb. "That dose? That concentration?" "You mean the same concentration you used on my father?" I asked, my voice hoarse but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Did you really think I didn't know? That I hadn't spent 5 years watching you, learning from you, preparing for this moment?" The police entered then, led by Detective Sarah Mills, who I'd been secretly working with for the past 2 years, feeding her information about Victoria's activities through anonymous tips and carefully placed evidence. She approached Victoria with handcuffs ready. "Victoria Chen, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Lily Chen and for the murder of William Chen. You have the right to remain silent." "No," Victoria screamed, struggling against the officers. "The shares are mine. I have the papers. She signed them over to me." I stood slowly, steadying myself against Dr. Webb as I faced the woman who'd destroyed my family twice. About those papers, I said, pulling out my phone and displaying the relevant section of the company charter. There's an interesting clause about blood relatives and temporary guardianship. Since you're not a blood relative and you've just been arrested for crimes against the family, those shares revert immediately back to me. The room erupted in chaos. Board members demanded explanations. Reporters shouted questions. Photographers captured every moment of Victoria's complete descent from triumph to destruction. Through it all, I stood calm and steady, watching the woman who'd killed me once get dragged away in chains, but the revelations weren't over. As Victoria was being led out, she turned back to me with pure hatred in her eyes. "You think you've won?" she spat. "You have no idea what I've done to this company. The patents I've filed, the deals I've made, the research I've stolen. Without me, Chen Pharmaceuticals will crumble within a year." "You mean the patents filed under your shell companies?" I asked, producing a folder I'd been carrying all evening. "The ones registered to VChem Industries, Chen Medical Innovations, and Phoenix Pharmaceutical Development? The companies you thought were so cleverly hidden but were actually registered to addresses I own, with documentation I've been collecting for 3 years." Victoria's face went from red to white to gray in the span of seconds. I continued, my voice carrying across the silent room. "Every patent you filed, every innovation you claimed, every piece of research you stole, including my mother's cancer treatment that you've been developing in secret. It's all documented here, the real documents, not the forgeries you've been showing the board. And as for those deals you've made, I've already been in contact with your partners. They're quite interested to learn they've been negotiating with a murderer who never actually had the authority to make those agreements." "But the research," Victoria said desperately. "The formulas, the compounds, they're all in my head. You need me." "No," I said simply. "I don't. You see, while you were busy plotting and scheming, I was watching you work. That hidden camera in your private lab? I installed it 2 years ago. Every formula you developed, every compound you created, every brilliant innovation you claimed as your own, I have it all recorded. Your entire life's work, documented and preserved. The company doesn't need you. It never did." The police finally dragged her away, her screams echoing through the marble halls until the doors closed behind her. The room remained frozen for a moment before Thomas Chen began to slow clap. Others joined in, and soon the entire room was applauding, though I could see the mix of emotions on their faces. Relief, shock, admiration, and not a small amount of fear. I raised my hand for silence. "I know tonight has been shocking for everyone. You came here expecting a simple transfer of power, and instead you witnessed something none of us should have had to see. But I want you all to know that Chen Pharmaceuticals is stronger than one person's evil. My father built this company on the principles of healing and helping others. My mother gave her life to research that could save millions. That legacy doesn't die with Victoria's betrayal." I turned to the board members who were watching me with new respect and wariness. "Tomorrow, we begin the real work. We'll audit everything, review every project, and ensure that all of Victoria's theft and corruption is rooted out. But we'll also move forward with the cancer treatment my mother started and Victoria tried to steal. We'll honor the partnerships that were made in good faith. And we'll restore Chen Pharmaceuticals to what it was always meant to be, a force for good in this world." The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. The trial was swift and decisive. With the evidence I'd gathered and Victoria's public attempt on my life, conviction was guaranteed. She was sentenced to life in prison for my father's murder and my attempted murder, with additional sentences for fraud, embezzlement, and corporate espionage that ensured she'd never see freedom again. The company audit revealed the full extent of Victoria's corruption, but also her genuine brilliance. She had made real innovations, developed valuable compounds, and created profitable partnerships. I kept what was good and discarded what was tainted, rebuilding the company with a mixture of old wisdom and new innovation. My mother's cancer treatment, finally completed with the research Victoria had stolen and hidden, went to trial within 6 months. It was everything my mother had hoped, a revolutionary therapy that could treat previously incurable cancers with minimal side effects. We named it the Elizabeth Chen Protocol, ensuring my mother's name would live on in every life it saved. The board, initially skeptical of my youth and methods, became my strongest supporters, as I demonstrated not just business acumen, but the kind of ethical leadership my father had once embodied. We expanded carefully, strategically, always keeping patient welfare at the center of our decisions. But perhaps the most satisfying part of my victory wasn't the company's success or Victoria's imprisonment. It was the small moments of justice that followed. Victoria's hidden lover, the one she'd confessed to about killing my father, turned out to be a con artist who'd been planning to murder her for her money once she'd secured the company. He was arrested trying to flee the country with millions he'd embezzled from Victoria's secret accounts. The psychiatrist who'd provided false diagnoses about my mental health lost his license and faced criminal charges. The witnesses Victoria had paid to lie about me came forward with the truth, clearing my name completely. Every single person who'd participated in her schemes faced consequences, while those who'd stood by me, even quietly, were rewarded. A year after the party that changed everything, I stood in my father's office, now my office, looking out at the city skyline. Chen Pharmaceuticals' stock had doubled in value. We'd launched 3 new life-saving drugs. The Elizabeth Chen Foundation, which I'd established with my inherited wealth, had already funded research that would benefit millions. On my desk was a letter from Victoria, forwarded by her lawyer. I'd received dozens of these over the months, alternating between threats, pleas for mercy, and elaborate schemes for revenge she could never execute from her cell. This one was different, though. Shorter, just 3 lines. "You let me poison you. You knew what would happen and you let me do it anyway. Why?" I picked up my pen and wrote my response, knowing it would be the last time I'd ever acknowledge her existence. "Because you needed to believe you'd won. Victory makes people careless, and your victory was always going to be the poison that destroyed you. I just had to make sure you drank deeply enough to never recover." I sealed the letter and handed it to my assistant to mail, then turned back to the work at hand. There were new drugs to develop, lives to save, and a legacy to build. Victoria was the past, a cautionary tale about the price of greed and the power of patient justice. But sometimes, late at night, I thought about that moment when I drank the poisoned champagne for the second time, knowing what would happen, choosing to walk into death's embrace again. It took a special kind of madness to die twice by the same hand, to trust that my preparations were enough, that the antidote would work, that all my pieces would fall into place at just the right moment. Victoria had been right about one thing. I had let her win. I'd handed her everything she'd ever wanted on a silver platter. The company, the wealth, the power, the legacy. For one shining moment, she'd had it all, and that's exactly why she lost everything. The morning sun streamed through my office windows, painting golden patterns across the mahogany desk that had been my father's and his father's before him. It was the same light that had woken me on that impossible morning 5 years ago when I'd found myself reborn with all my memories intact. Back then, it had felt like a curse, carrying the weight of a future I couldn't prevent. Now, it felt like a gift. Not the second chance itself, but the wisdom to know that sometimes the only way to defeat someone is to let them think they've already won. My phone buzzed with a message from Thomas Chen. "Board meeting in an hour. The proposal for the new pediatric research wing is ready for approval." I smiled, straightening my mother's portrait on the wall. She looked young in the photo, barely older than I was now, holding a baby version of me while my father stood beside her, his arm around us both. We looked happy. We looked whole. We looked like the family Victoria had tried so hard to destroy. But families, real families, are stronger than any poison. Love is stronger than hate. And sometimes, justice comes not as a sword, but as a chalice, offered with a smile to those who thirst for power above all else. Let them drink deeply, I thought, gathering my papers for the meeting. Let them taste victory. It makes the fall so much sweeter. The conference room was full when I arrived, the board members already seated around the polished table. These weren't the same people who'd witnessed my theatrical death a year ago. I'd restructured the board, bringing in younger voices, medical professionals who understood our mission, and ethical business leaders who valued integrity over pure profit. But Thomas remained, my one link to the old guard and the man who'd trusted me when no one else would. "The pediatric research wing proposal," I began, pulling up the presentation, "isn't just about expanding our facilities. It's about returning to what Chen Pharmaceuticals was founded to do. Put patients first, especially the most vulnerable. Dr. Sarah Kim, our newest board member and a pediatric oncologist, leaned forward. The projected costs are significant. Some shareholders might balk at the reduced profit margins. They might, I agreed. But I'd rather have shareholders who understand that some things matter more than maximum profit. My mother died trying to cure cancer. My father died because someone valued money over family. I won't let their deaths mean nothing. The vote was unanimous. As the board members filed out discussing implementation strategies and timeline, Thomas lingered behind. Your father would be proud, he said quietly. Both of them would. I hope so, I replied, then hesitated. Thomas, can I ask you something? That night when you opened the safety deposit box and found all that evidence, were you surprised? He considered the question carefully. Surprised by the evidence? No. I'd suspected Victoria for years but could never prove anything. Surprised that you'd gathered it all, that you'd planned everything so perfectly? Also, no. He smiled slightly. You're your mother's daughter. She was brilliant, strategic, and patient. But she was also kind. That's what Victoria never understood. She thought kindness was a weakness. It's not. No, Thomas said firmly. Kindness is what stops us from becoming the monsters we fight. You could have simply had Victoria arrested quietly, avoided the whole dramatic scene. But you gave her the chance to reveal herself, to make her own choices. You were kind enough to let her destroy herself rather than destroying her yourself. After he left, I stood alone in the conference room, looking at the city sprawling below. Somewhere out there, in a maximum security prison 200 miles away, Victoria was probably pacing her cell, reliving that night over and over, trying to understand how her perfect plan had failed. She'd probably spend the rest of her life analyzing every moment, looking for the flaw in her strategy, the mistake that had cost her everything. She'd never find it because the flaw wasn't in her plan. It was in her. She'd been so focused on winning that she'd never questioned what victory would cost. She'd been so eager to take what was mine that she'd never wondered why I was so willing to give it away. My phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. It was my assistant, Linda, a sharp young woman who'd started as an intern during my darkest days and had risen through the ranks through sheer determination and talent. Miss Chen, there's a young woman here to see you. She says she's Victoria's daughter. I froze. Victoria didn't have children, at least not in my first life. But then again, there had been 5 years of differences this time around, small changes that rippled outward. Send her in, I said, curious despite myself. The woman who entered looked nothing like Victoria. She was soft where Victoria had been sharp, with gentle eyes and nervous hands that fluttered as she spoke. Miss Chen, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm Emma Morrison. Victoria was my biological mother. She gave me up for adoption when I was born, 23 years ago. I only found out recently, after her arrest. The publicity made it impossible to ignore. I gestured for her to sit, studying her carefully. She had Victoria's cheekbones, but none of her predatory grace. What can I do for you, Emma? I wanted to apologize, she said, surprising me, for what she did to your family, and to ask a favor. She pulled out a worn notebook. My adoptive parents are wonderful people, but they're struggling. My dad has cancer, ironically enough, and the treatments are bankrupting them. I'm not asking for money, she added quickly. I'm a biochemist, like her. I was hoping maybe I could apply for a position here. I know it's presumptuous given everything, but where did you study? I interrupted gently. MIT for undergrad, Johns Hopkins for my PhD. I specialized in targeted cancer therapies. She laughed bitterly. I wanted to cure cancer. Imagine my surprise when I learned my biological mother murdered someone and my biological grandmother died of the disease I've dedicated my life to fighting. I looked at her for a long moment, this unexpected ripple in my carefully orchestrated victory. Victoria's daughter, raised by loving parents, becoming everything Victoria could have been if she'd chosen differently. It was almost poetic. Can you start Monday? I asked. Emma's eyes widened. You're not going to interview me? Check my credentials? I could be lying about everything. You're not, I said simply. You have your mother's intelligence, but none of her hatred. That makes you either very lucky or very strong. Either way, Chen Pharmaceuticals needs people like you. I stood, extending my hand. But Emma, you should know that working here means working under my mother's shadow. The Elizabeth Chen protocol is our flagship treatment. Can you handle that? She shook my hand firmly. Miss Chen, I've been living under shadows my whole life. At least this one might help people. After she left, I realized the true poetry of the moment. Victoria had spent so much time and effort trying to steal my mother's legacy, and now her own daughter would help fulfill it. The ripples of our choices, spreading outward in ways we never anticipate. That evening, I visited my parents' graves for the first time since the trial. They were buried side by side in the family plot, their headstones simple and elegant. I'd had fresh flowers placed there weekly, but this was my first personal visit. "Hi, Mom, Dad," I said, sitting on the bench between their graves. "I wanted to tell you it's over, really over this time. Victoria's gone, the company is safe, and your research is saving lives." The cemetery was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. "I met her daughter today," I continued. "Victoria's daughter. She's nothing like her mother. She wants to cure cancer, just like you did, Mom. I hired her. I think you would have liked that. Turning something poisonous into something healing." I talked until the sun set, telling them about the company's progress, the new research initiatives, the lives their work had touched. I told them about the nights I'd cried myself to sleep in boarding school, about the moment I'd realized I'd been given a second chance, about the terrible decision to let Victoria poison me again. "I don't know if you would have approved," I admitted. "The games I played, the deceptions I orchestrated, you were both so straightforward, so honest. But I learned something important. Sometimes the only way to stop someone who fights dirty is to let them think the ring is theirs." As I stood to leave, a memory surfaced, something my mother had told me when I was very young, maybe 6 or 7. We'd been in the garden, and I'd been crying because some girls at school had been mean to me. "Lily," she'd said, kneeling down to my level, "people who hurt others are usually hurting themselves. That doesn't excuse what they do, but understanding it helps us choose how to respond. We can hurt them back, or we can be smarter. We can let them exhaust themselves with their own hatred while we build something better." I hadn't understood then, but I understood now. Victoria had exhausted herself with hatred, consumed herself with greed, destroyed herself with her own ambitions. I had simply provided the stage. Back at the office that night, working late on the pediatric wing plans, I found myself thinking about the concept of victory. Victoria had thought victory meant taking everything from others. My father had thought victory meant building an empire. My mother had thought victory meant healing the sick. But real victory, I'd learned, wasn't about winning or losing. It was about becoming who you were meant to be, despite everyone who tried to make you something else. Victoria had tried to make me a victim, then a villain, then a corpse. Instead, I'd become something else entirely. Someone who could die twice and live to tell about it. Someone who could hand over everything and somehow keep it all. Someone who could serve poison with a smile and call it justice. The security guard knocked on my door around midnight. "Miss Chen, you should go home. You've been here since dawn." "Just finishing up, Robert," I said, saving my work. "How's your grandson doing?" "Much better, thanks to the new treatment program. Doctor says he'll make a full recovery." Another life saved, another ripple spreading outward. I gathered my things and headed for the elevator, pausing at the portrait wall in the lobby. My grandparents, my parents, and now me. 5 generations of Chens who'd built this company one breakthrough at a time. Victoria's portrait had been removed the day after her arrest, leaving a pale rectangle on the wall that we'd never bothered to repair. It served as a reminder that not everyone who joins a family has its best interests at heart. But Emma would be different. I was certain of that. She'd already sent me her research portfolio, and it was brilliant. Innovative approaches to targeted therapy that built on my mother's work in ways Victoria never could have imagined. The daughter surpassing the mother, healing what the other had poisoned. The next morning brought a surprise. My lawyer arrived with a package that had been held in escrow for exactly 1 year after Victoria's arrest, as per legal requirements. "It's from your father," he explained. "He set this up about a month before his death, with instructions to deliver it to you 1 year after Victoria was no longer part of the company, however that came about." My hands shook as I opened the package. Inside was a letter in my father's handwriting and a small velvet box. "My dearest Lily," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then you've discovered the truth about Victoria and survived it. I pray I'm wrong about my suspicions, but the irregularities in my recent blood work suggest otherwise." I had to stop reading, overwhelmed by the realization that he'd known. He'd known she was poisoning him. "I could confront her, but I fear what she might do to you in retaliation. So instead, I'm playing a longer game. I've hidden assets she doesn't know about, protected patents she can't access, and most importantly, I've ensured that the blood legacy provision in our charter remains ironclad. She may think she's won, but victory built on murder is built on sand." The letter went on to detail hidden accounts, research facilities in Switzerland that operated under shell companies, and a network of allies who'd been waiting for Victoria's downfall. My father had been preparing for this fight even as the poison coursed through his veins. "The box contains your mother's real engagement ring," the letter concluded. "Victoria never knew I kept it. She wore a replica to our wedding, thinking she had everything that was Elizabeth's. But the real treasures, my darling daughter, were never hers to take. They were always yours to inherit. All my love, Dad." I opened the velvet box through tears, finding my mother's ring. A simple sapphire surrounded by diamonds. Nothing like the ostentatious jewelry Victoria had favored. It fit perfectly on my right hand, a circle of continuity connecting past and future. Thomas arrived an hour later for our weekly meeting, finding me still staring at the ring. "He knew," I said without preamble. "My father knew Victoria was killing him." Thomas nodded slowly. "I suspected he might. William was too smart to be completely fooled. But knowing and proving are different things, and he loved you too much to risk your life with a direct confrontation. So we both played the same game," I mused, letting her think she'd won to protect what really mattered. Like father, like daughter. That afternoon, Emma started her first day early, eager and nervous in equal measure. I gave her the tour personally, showing her the labs where her biological grandmother had worked, the research that had started it all. "This is incredible," she breathed, looking at the original notebooks. "The foundation for the Elizabeth Chen protocol, it's genius." "Your mother thought so too," I said carefully. "She tried to claim credit for completing it." Emma's face darkened. "Of course she did." Then, more quietly, "Did she have any genuine achievements? Or was it all stolen?" "She was brilliant," I admitted. "Her improvements to the synthesis process increased efficiency by 40%. Her approach to molecular binding was innovative. She could have been remembered as a great scientist if she hadn't chosen to be a murderer instead." "Choices," Emma said softly. "It always comes down to choices, doesn't it? I thought about my choice to drink the poison twice. My father's choice to die rather than risk my life. My mother's choice to dedicate her life to healing. Victoria's choice to take what wasn't hers." "Yes," I agreed, "it always comes down to choices." The months that followed were a whirlwind of growth and innovation. Emma's research proved even more promising than her portfolio had suggested. She had an intuitive understanding of molecular biology that rivaled Victoria's, but coupled with an ethical framework that made her trustworthy. Within 6 months, she was heading her own research team, developing a new branch of the Elizabeth Chen protocol that could treat pediatric cancers previously considered untreatable. The pediatric wing opened on the first anniversary of Victoria's imprisonment. We named it the William Chen Center for Pediatric Oncology, and I made sure the dedication plaque mentioned that he'd given his life to protect the future of medical innovation. It was the closest I could come to publicly acknowledging his sacrifice. The opening gala was everything Victoria would have wanted for herself. Influential guests, media coverage, champagne toast to success. But instead of corporate executives and society photographers, our guests were the families of children who'd been saved by our treatments, researchers who dedicated their lives to fighting cancer, and doctors who worked miracles daily. Emma gave a speech about redemption through science, about choosing to heal rather than harm. about the legacy we leave being determined not by our blood, but by our choices. She never mentioned Victoria by name, but everyone understood. The daughter had chosen to be everything the mother had refused to be. As the evening wound down, I found myself on the same balcony where Victoria had handed me the poisoned champagne in another lifetime. The city sprawled below, lights twinkling like stars brought to earth. But this time, I wasn't alone. Emma stood beside me, along with Thomas, Dr. Webb, and the core team who'd helped me rebuild the company. To second chances, Thomas proposed, raising his glass of decidedly non-poisoned champagne. To justice served cold, Dr. Webb added with a wry smile. To choosing healing over hatred, Emma contributed. I raised my own glass, thinking of all the paths that had led to this moment. Death and rebirth, poison and antidote, victory and defeat, all tangled together in a web that Victoria never saw coming. To family, I said finally, echoing Victoria's toast from that fateful night. Both the family we're born into and the family we choose. To legacy, not stolen but earned. And to new beginnings, built on the ashes of what came before. We drank, the champagne sweet and untainted on my tongue. Below us, the city hummed with life. Millions of people living, dying, fighting, surviving. Somewhere among them were the thousands who'd been saved by the treatments we'd developed. Children who would grow up because of my mother's research. Families kept whole by my father's sacrifice and my willingness to die twice for justice. Victoria had been wrong about so many things, but she'd been right about one. Victory was intoxicating. But true victory, the kind that mattered, the kind that lasted, wasn't about taking from others. It was about building something they couldn't tear down, becoming someone they couldn't destroy, choosing love over fear and healing over harm. The poison Victoria had served me had been meant to end my story. Instead, it had been the catalyst for her own destruction. She'd handed me the very weapon I needed to defeat her, never realizing that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone's evil consume them while you rise above it. As the party ended and the guests departed, I stayed on the balcony a moment longer. A year ago, I'd been dead on the marble floor below, Victoria's triumph complete. Now she was in prison. Her daughter was healing the sick in ways Victoria never could, and the company she'd killed to possess was stronger than ever. "You let me win," Victoria had written in her letter. Why? The answer was simple, though she'd never understand it. Because her victory was always poisoned, from the very first drop of ambition that had led her to murder. Every triumph built on someone else's destruction carries the seeds of its own downfall. I had simply made sure those seeds had fertile ground to grow. The security guard called up that it was time to lock the building. I took one last look at the city, at the life thrumming beyond the glass and steel, at the future spreading out like an infinite web of possibilities. Then I went home to the mansion that had once felt like a prison, now transformed into a haven. The portraits on the walls told the story. My grandparents who'd started with nothing, my parents who'd built an empire of healing, and me, who'd died twice to preserve it all. In my study, I kept a single photo from Victoria's victory party, the moment she'd raised her glass in triumph, completely unaware that she was toasting her own downfall. It served as a reminder that victory and defeat often wear the same face, separated only by time and truth. I poured myself a brandy from my father's collection, the one Victoria had never known existed, hidden behind a false panel in his study. Each bottle had a story, a memory, a moment of celebration or contemplation. This one was from my parents' wedding, saved for a special occasion that had never come in his lifetime. "To you, Dad," I whispered, raising the glass, "for teaching me that sometimes the best way to fight is to appear not to be fighting at all." The brandy was smooth, aged to perfection, nothing like the bitter poison Victoria had served. But in its own way, it was just as powerful. A reminder that good things come to those who wait, who plan, who choose their moments carefully. My phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Working late on the new synthesis. I think I found a way to reduce the side effects by 60%. Thank you for believing in me, despite everything." I smiled, typing back, "Thank you for choosing to be better than your origins. See you at tomorrow's board meeting." The cycle continued. Innovation, dedication, the slow work of building something meaningful. Victoria had wanted overnight victory, instant gratification, immediate domination, but real success, lasting success, was patient. It grew slowly, roots spreading deep and wide, until it became impossible to tear down. 5 years ago, I'd awakened in my childhood bedroom with impossible memories of a future that hadn't happened yet. I'd tried to change things directly and failed. I'd tried to save my father and watched him die anyway. I'd faced the horrible realization that some futures couldn't be prevented, only prepared for. But I'd also learned that poison could become medicine in the right hands, that death could lead to rebirth, that sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to let it devour itself. Victoria had thought she was taking everything from me. Instead, she'd given me the tools for her own destruction. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, the sound echoing through the empty mansion. Another day ending, another beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to heal and grow and build. The pediatric wing would treat its first patients. Emma would continue her research. The board would approve new initiatives. And somewhere in a cell she'd never leave, Victoria would realize that her victory had always been an illusion, a poisoned chalice I'd prepared specifically for her. She'd wanted to win so badly that she'd never questioned the ease of her triumph, never wondered why I'd smiled as I signed away my birthright, never suspected that the greatest victory is sometimes disguised as defeat. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, the same room where I'd awakened to my second chance. The moonlight streamed through the windows, painting silver patterns on the walls. On my nightstand sat 3 photos. My parents on their wedding day, my mother holding me as a baby, and my father in his office, looking proud and strong before Victoria's poison had begun its work. "I did it," I whispered to them. "I let her win, and in winning, she lost everything." Sleep came easily that night, deep and dreamless. There were no more battles to fight, no more poisons to drink, no more deaths to die. Victoria was gone, her toxins neutralized, her legacy erased except as a cautionary tale. The company thrived. The research continued. Lives were saved daily by the work my mother had started and I had completed. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I wondered about the other timeline, the one where I hadn't been reborn, where Victoria's victory had been complete. Did that version of reality still exist somewhere? A world where she'd won and I'd stayed dead? Or had my rebirth erased it entirely, rewriting history with each choice I'd made? It didn't matter, really. This was the reality that mattered, the one where justice had been served and healing triumphed over harm. The one where Victoria's daughter chose redemption over revenge, where my father's sacrifice meant something, where my mother's research saved lives instead of lining Victoria's pockets. The next morning brought sun and purpose, another day of building something worthwhile. I arrived at the office early, as always, finding Emma already in the lab, lost in her work. She looked up as I passed, offering a smile that held no trace of her mother's calculating coldness. "The new synthesis is even more promising than I thought," she said excitedly. "We could be ready for trials within the month." "Then let's make it happen," I replied. "Your grandmother would be proud." She blinked, surprised. "You mean—" Elizabeth Chen was a brilliant scientist who dedicated her life to healing. You're continuing her work with integrity she would have admired. That makes you her true heir, regardless of blood. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. That means everything." I left her to her work, understanding washing over me. This was the real victory, not Victoria's destruction, but Emma's redemption. Not the poison I'd drunk, but the antidote I'd prepared. Not the death I'd died, but the life I'd built from its ashes. Victoria had been right that her victory was a poisoned chalice I'd prepared. She'd been wrong about everything else. The poison wasn't in the champagne, or the shares, or the company itself. It was in the very nature of victory achieved through murder and betrayal. That kind of triumph carries its own destruction. A timer counting down to the moment when the lies collapse and the truth emerges. I'd simply made sure I was there to witness it, alive and well, despite her best efforts, ready to rebuild what she'd tried to destroy. And in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all, not her suffering, but our thriving. Not her imprisonment, but our freedom to continue the work she'd tried to corrupt. The story could end here with Victoria defeated and justice served. But life, unlike stories, doesn't have neat endings. It continues, day after day, choice after choice, each decision rippling outward in ways we can't always predict. 2 years after Victoria's imprisonment, Emma made a breakthrough that revolutionized cancer treatment worldwide. 5 years after, Chen Pharmaceuticals became the leading force in pediatric oncology research. 10 years after, the Elizabeth Chen protocol had saved over 1 million lives. And through it all, I remembered the taste of poison on my tongue, the feel of death creeping through my veins, the impossible gift of a second chance to make things right. Victoria had given me those things, unknowingly handing me the very tools of her own destruction. But more than that, she'd taught me the most valuable lesson of all. True victory isn't about defeating your enemies. It's about becoming someone they could never defeat, no matter how many times they try to poison you. And that's a victory no amount of champagne, poisoned or otherwise, could ever wash away.